Welcome to the Tropic Zone. I am your host, Andrew Scarrett. Today on the Tropic Zone, my guest is Jonathan Escoffery, author of the acclaimed how author of the acclaimed If I Survive You, a eight-story short story collection that has really caught a lot of notice, and it's an award-winning collection. And Jonathan is the featured speaker for the Florida A&M 15th Annual Literary Forum. And this year's forum theme is I Am Because We Are, Identity, Migration, and Defining Self in the African Diaspora. Jonathan, welcome to the Tropic Zone.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
You're going to be talking about identity, migration, and defining self in the African diaspora. You are the son of Jamaican parents who migrated to the United States. How do you define yourself as a person and as a writer? Jamaican American, African American?
Jamaican American and African American. If I can have both. I think in comprising the stories in the collection, that was something I was interested in exploring. Like how do you carry forward your Jamaican lineage if you're fully invested in your American today, your lived experience of today. I walk through the world primarily as a Black man in America, but that doesn't necessitate my denial of my heritage. And I'm always interested in this question of for people who have a history that is embedded in colonialism, as Jamaicans do, and as many West Indians do, the question of ethnicity and claiming an ethnicity, that we can do so with pride in a way that does not, in this country, speaking in the context of a second generation immigrant, taking pride in my Jamaicanness without that coming at any cost to my pride as an African American or as a Black American. And so I think there are ways in which we're still negotiating these conversations on a more national stage in a way that we can all feel comfortable about, one identity not negating the other identity. And the way we do that, because sometimes I speak with scholars. I speak with my friends who are not scholars, who do not consider themselves scholars, but who feel a lot more comfortable to call themselves Black American more so than African American. And I mean people who have for generations their families have been in the United States. And for me, I think there is that long view of looking at the African diaspora that I think is what really solidifies us and brings us together, and understanding our history and understanding. And this is a bit of a tangent, but I've had people who say, well, if you're from the Caribbean, what do you know about that experience of the kind of bondage that brought us here? And it's like, if you understand your history, it's that same transatlantic slave trade. And there are even scholars in Jamaica who try to pose Jamaicans as also African Americans as part of the again, as posing our identity as part of this shared history, rather than looking at the differences in our history. And that's a complex question that is less accepted. So I don't have to go too far down that path. But what I like about it is the fact that if we can find the commonality and focus on the commonality, I think we're stronger together. I think for both having understanding of our shared history, I think that leaves us in a better place to understand how we can move forward and have a fruitful future. I think our destinies are absolutely tied up, and so and that's and that's my long answer for embracing Jamaican Americanness and African Americanness as well. Um,
Well,
yeah,
I appreciate that because you've talked about the tension between the two, and as somebody who migrated from the Caribbean as an adult, one of the things I like to tell people, I came as a man and discovered that I was a black man, and
right.
you talked about your parents coming
Mhm.
belatedly to the understanding that no, that here they may have come as Jamaicans, but here they're considered black,
Right.
and we hear about the superiority. Um, how do you find yourself handling those issues in your fiction in terms of the tension between the migrant and the
Mhm.
and the African person of color? How do you handle that, address that in your fiction?
Well, I think it's exactly as you posed it, right? You came thinking of yourself as a man, and then you have a new racialized experience within the United States, within the context of the United States, and I think, and I will answer your question, but I think it's important to say that I think that's for people who have not had that experience, for people who are born into the context of a racialized experience, whose parents lived their entire lives with a racialized experience. I think it's a difficult thing for some people to hear the attitudes of Caribbean people who arrive and have to, in a sense, learn that. And the way I handle that in my fiction, I mean, I've written about a family who, um, the youngest of two brothers, the younger of two brothers, is coming into trying to figure out how to move through the world. He's trying to figure out and answer these questions about race and whether or not he is black. And when he's a child, around the age of 9 or 10 years old, he asks his mother, um, first he repeats the question that is asked of him, which is, what are you? So he asks his mother, what am I? And that's kind of it's a badly phrased thing that people do, especially in South Florida. They ask that a lot. But he eventually says, Mom, am I black? And she kind of stutters around the question, and she gives this complex breakdown of what she knows of the family lineage, listing European ancestors and all of this stuff. But and so Chelani is confused, and he moves forward a bit confused, and he's trying to figure himself out because his parents haven't really handed him the guidebook, or not, they haven't handed him a sufficient amount of guidance on these questions. And he goes away for college, and he's away from his family for a bit, and then he has this conversation with his mother, and his mother tells him that she's moving back to Jamaica. And he says, why? You haven't lived there for, half your life at this point. And she says, because America is too hard for a black woman. And for me, it's that moment where it's like, even though she, in a way, has been a part of Chelani, her son's confusion about race and identity, she herself has now lived, a couple of decades or more in the United States. And the same person who was saying you're a little of this and you're a little of that has learned, she's been taught very well over the course of decades, I am a black woman. And being a black woman in America is a difficult thing. And so I wanted to show I wanted to make sure I didn't skirt around these kind of uncomfortable, difficult conversations. And at the same time, I wanted to show that even for the person who is uncomfortable in accepting or embracing blackness, that doesn't mean that that's the same person. That person's going to have the same attitude 20 odd laters, 20 odd years down the road. And so I wanted to show that growth with these characters and make sure I'm having the conversations, but I'm also evolving the conversations with these characters.
Thank you. Let me reintroduce you. I'm speaking with Jonathan Escoffery, author of If I Survive You, and an award-winning short story collection. You mentioned Trelawney, the main character. That's a place name in Jamaica with a lot of history. Is there any significance to your choice of of Trelawney as the name of that character? Are you trying to tell us something here?
Simply, I wanted it to be a parish in Jamaica, one that that does have a complicated history, and at the same time, it's like he has that name because his father wanted to remind himself. It's almost like an irony, I think, because his father wanted to remind himself of like how he's idealized Jamaica, and yet the part of Jamaica he's idealized, or the name that he's chosen, um is one that has, is coming from a problematic historical figures in the first place, in the context of Jamaican history. Beyond that, I mean, that's about where I wanted to kind of leave it. But I wanted, yeah, I
Okay.
wanted it to remain kind of present. Yeah,
I,
sorry, go ahead.
I appreciate it because I've listened to some of your interviews and I noticed that nobody brought it up, and I'm thinking, yeah, Trelawney is a big, and with the Maroons and everything, that history, the history,
Mhm.
and so I wanted to address that. How did you find your voice? I mean, Trelawney finds his voice in your work. How did Jonathan find his voice as a writer?
Yeah, reading a lot of, in particular, I mean, there's two things. I think when, depending on your education, the books that were placed in front of you to read as a child, as somebody, making your way through, your primary education, and even post secondary education, you can come away with an idea that you need to write in a particular way, that is a particular Eurocentric kind of way. I know I certainly, tried to, in a sense, copy what I read as an earlier, reader. I remember trying to write like Edgar Allan Poe, at a certain point, and realizing that writing like Edgar Allan Poe for the 21st century made absolutely, no sense. Um, and so I wanted to start writing stories, in which characters sounded a lot more like the people who I know in the real world, my family, my friends, the people I grew up with. And that includes a range of voices. So that's not just one voice. And that was part of both the challenge and the joy of writing the book, was bringing in these different voices. Um, and and that's, I grew up in Miami, so I wanted the Jamaican patois to be present. I wanted, Cuban Spanish to be present. I wanted some of the more like rural, voices to that I've from that I've known, as well, like thinking about Delano and his tree service and the people working there, and so on and so forth. The challenge in finding that is, like, if you're not reading a lot of that, then it becomes very difficult to, even though it's like you want a book that sounds like the real world, it's still downright or damn near necessary to find the examples in literature where people are actually doing maybe not the exact same thing that you're doing, but doing it in like a parallel lane to what you're doing. And so, reading a lot of first and second generation Caribbean immigrants, was really helpful for me. And so in grad school, I came to the work of Junot Diaz. Before that, in college, I read, A House on Mango Street was a big influence. Reading some Jamaica Kincaid around that same time, and then later reading Marlon James. Marlon James was kind of huge for me to discover the way he captures all those different voices. Specific, I mean, in more than one book, certainly. Look, the book of Night Women, we hear all these different distinct, voices, but, A Brief History of Seven Killings in particular, because there's so many characters, dozens of characters in that book, and even across he's smart to not have any one, Jamaican dialect or accent. The even the presentation of the language is done differently depending on which character you're following, and I found that to be really amazing and influential and freeing in a way. And just so I mean, just with those handful of authors as influences, I felt like I really could give voice to characters who looked a lot like the people I really know in the world, because there's a kind of, it's almost like a permission given when you're seeing other people have clearly done the same. They brought, maybe it's not the characters you read in Hawthorne or Dickens or any of these people, but these authors, but it's the contemporary, in particular, the contemporary fiction writers who are representing the people that look a lot closer to what you look like. That was helpful.
Thank you. I'll reintroduce you. I'm talking to Jonathan Escoffery, author of If I Survive You. This is the Tropic Zone. I'm your host, Andrew Scarrett. Your collection appears to me a celebration of language, of again, and of those voices which are not often celebrated. But my question was, as somebody who grew up with dialect and struggled to write it, to reproduce it as a writer, I know the Jamaica Gleaner does a great job of interviewing, of using the patois when they're talking to just regular people and bringing it to life. How challenging was it for you to write the patois? Because again, it's your mom's mother tongue, not necessarily yours.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think, my parents, their language is very much alive in my head, even when I don't use it typically. I grew up around a lot of, again, like second generation Jamaicans and other Caribbean people who, as kids, as teenagers, we'd be going out to a party that is primarily playing reggae and dancehall and maybe some soca. And we would play in the language, even though some of us there was degrees to which people are putting it on, and typically you're doing kind of a bad job of it. And you would only really say it like within the community. You wouldn't do it with Americans, or you wouldn't do it with you know people who aren't of that same heritage. But there was a sense of play, and so I was always interested in the language. And again, I mean, I think it just took reading a few books, either by Jamaicans or other Caribbean people too. Tiffany Unique is a Caribbean author from the Virgin Islands, who is really great at writing dialects in a way that it's less about phonetics and more about the syntax and like the ordering of the words. And just looking at different ways that different people have presented the language on the page, that was really helpful for me. And then I mean, it would help to just throw on my favorite Bounty Killer or Capleton or something in the background while I'm writing it and making sure. I mean, to be honest, like the hardest part was just kind of deciding on almost like a rule book for it. Not so much about trying to have, okay, is this authentic sounding? It's more like I can't be just throwing in words for no reason. And the most difficult thing, I think, is, like maybe it's a problem of publishing. Maybe it's how Americans think about immigrants, but thinking about how somebody who a middle-class Jamaican who grew up in in the British school system, how they would have such a variety, a wide like range of language to use between what they're supposed to be speaking in class, to like how they might speak to their friends and how they might pick up the patois. And to me, that was the hardest thing, because I think in publishing, educated Americans have a really difficult time with the idea that that Black immigrants can speak more ways than one.
Yes.
I guess to leave it there. And so that was probably my biggest challenge. And I don't know that I passed that challenge, but I had to set a kind of rule book for myself and think about, and that's where I have more, it's less about the father character Topper kind of code switching. I kind of decided it would be easier just to have him using the language he does, whereas Delano, who was born in Jamaica and lived there for a little bit, a few years, he's the one who's a little bit more in a kind of fluctuation, code switching kind of mode.
Thank you very much. That really explains it to a large extent. Just a couple more questions because I know you're working on your PhD out west, and so I know that you've got a lot of reading and a lot of writing to do. What was that aha moment, that big breakthrough moment when you got because you've published a number of short stories and now you've got a book. And was it difficult finding a publisher who's interested?
It was difficult publishing some of the earlier stories.
Mhm.
And I'd say it's always difficult publishing stories because even when people are asking you
Yeah, yes, yeah,
for
yeah.
those stories,
Mhm.
as your name is getting out a little bit and they see, okay, you won that award, I'll solicit. They either show up in my email or they show up in my agent's email asking for a piece. And even then, it's still kind of difficult to get a story published. The book, though, oddly, I mean, it's the book really took off. I knew it was going to be an exciting publication and book sale from just a couple days after my agent took the book out, just because so many people were showing interest, and not just directly through her, but I was hearing from people. You hang around in the literary world long enough, you meet people, people who are assistant editors at different publishing houses, or maybe they're on the sales team, and that's not even maybe how you met. Maybe you just met at some reading somewhere. And so many people were writing me and telling me how excited New York publishing was for the book, that I knew it was going to go pretty quickly, and it would be kind of a positive experience. So, and I was really happy. And I know, it's kind of like we were talking earlier, Alexia Arthurs, Marlon James, Nicole Dennis Ben, absolutely. Like those are writers who paved the way for me, and made it, less scary for me to go out with the book, but also it made publishing a lot less scared to take up a book like mine.
Yes.
So I always have to give credit to those people who came before me.
Okay. And finally, for people who have not who encountering your work for the first time, How I Survive You, what is one thing that you hope they take away from it?
I think I would want people to remember to try to see the world with fresh eyes, in a way, like, and what I'm trying to get at is like to see other people's humanity, regardless of where you think they are in terms of social class, or status. The thing that digs at me, I think, is when I speak to people in the US in particular about Jamaica and Jamaicans, and there's this absolute kind of flattening of how they see Jamaicans, and largely it's because these people are, they're at some resort in Montego Bay, or maybe Negril, and all they see is the resort, and then they see the people. They might have some kind of proximity when they are on the way from the airport to the resort, where they see, people who are who they are reducing to just like poverty, and are also reducing to, there's almost this sense that the essence of a Jamaican is their poverty and their willingness to work at a place like, well, I hate being specific about brand names, but what, fill in the blank, all inclusive resort, and that's their job, and their job is to, and I've been, as someone who grew up in Miami, I've been part of the tourism, hospitality economy, which means making people from elsewhere have a good time when they're here in your home city. And I've been that employee, and I've done that. But there's it's like people always come back and they say, there's just such poverty. They always reduce Jamaicans to like two things, and it's like they're poverty, but they're happy to serve us as well. And it's like I wish you would see more humanity, and hopefully in my book you might see that, because when I think Jamaicans, I think of this whole range. I think of my doctors who have been Jamaicans. I think of the entertainment lawyer who I just spoke with who's Jamaican. um and it's not just about like a fancy job, but it's the depth. And my characters make a lot of mistakes, and so where you have a Trelawney and a Topper, it's not that I'm trying to force propaganda to say that Jamaicans should be looked at in this magical light either, where there's this depth of humanity that we all have to make mistakes, but also to at times touch base with the greatness inside of us. And I think that lens, I'm talking about Jamaicans because they're in large part my subject matter, but that's anybody. That's walking down past, driving by Skid Row in LA. Think about the brilliant minds of the people who are living there, and their humanity, or apply that all across the board if you can.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan. And my guest on the Tropic Zone has been Jonathan Escoffery, author of the award-winning If I Survive You, an essay collection which captures the lives and the voices of Jamaican American immigrants in South Florida. Jonathan, thank you for being with us, and we're looking forward to the next installment. You've made quite an impression, and the world is anxious to hear that voice. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for talking with me.